We don't know the exact year Epictetus was born, or even his birth name. Epictetus itself simply means acquired or gained in Greek, a name that reflected his status as property, rather than a name given to him by parents who chose it with love. He was born into slavery sometime in the 1st century in the Roman province of Phrygia, in what is now central Turkey, and at some point in his early life he was brought to Rome, where he became the property of a man named Epictetus, himself a former slave who had risen to become a powerful secretary in the imperial household under the Emperor Nero. Details about his early years are scattered and incomplete, as they often are for enslaved people in the ancient world, whose lives were rarely recorded with any real care. Roman slavery in this period was not a single uniform experience. Some enslaved people worked brutal manual labour with no education and no hope of freedom, while others, particularly those in wealthy households, were sometimes given responsibilities and even education if their owners saw value in it. Epaphroditus's household appears to have fallen into the second category, which is likely the only reason we know anything about Epictetus at all. What we do know is that at some point his leg was permanently damaged, leaving him disabled for the rest of his life. Some ancient sources claim his own master caused the injury deliberately, twisting his leg as punishment, and that Epictetus reportedly warned his master calmly, even as it happened, that he would break the leg if he continued. And then, when the leg did break, is said to have simply noted that he'd told him it would happen, without anger, without pleading. Whether this specific story is entirely accurate or exaggerated by later admirers, it captures something real about the reputation he built during his lifetime, an almost unnatural steadiness, even while enduring real physical harm. Despite his circumstances, Epictetus was permitted to study philosophy, reportedly under a Stoic teacher named Musonius Rufus, one of the most respected philosophers in Rome at the time. This alone tells us something about the specific household he belonged to. Not every enslaved person in Rome had any access to education at all, let alone philosophical training under a well-known teacher. Epictetus clearly showed enough intellectual promise that his position afforded him this opportunity, unusual as it was. At some point, he was freed, likely after Nero's death in the year 68, during a period of upheaval when many people connected to the previous regime found their circumstances changing rapidly. As a free man, Epictetus began teaching philosophy himself, eventually opening his own school, but his path wasn't smooth, even after gaining his freedom. Around the year 93, the Emperor Domitian, wary of philosophers as potential critics of imperial power, banished all philosophers from Rome entirely. Epictetus relocated to Nicopolis, in Greece, and it was there that he built the school for which he's remembered today. Nicopolis itself was a fairly young city by Roman standards, founded a little over a century earlier by the Emperor Augustus to commemorate a naval victory nearby. It sat on a peninsula on the western coast of Greece, a genuine crossroads for travellers moving between Rome and the eastern provinces, which meant Epictetus's school wasn't tucked away in some quiet backwater. It was positioned exactly where curious, well-travelled visitors were likely to pass through and hear about a philosopher worth stopping for. There's something fitting in that. A man once confined entirely to someone else's household ended up teaching from a city built specifically to be crossed through, reaching students who came from far outside the narrow world he'd started in. The banishment itself is worth pausing on, because it says something about how Stoic philosophy was actually perceived by people in power at the time. This wasn't seen as harmless, comforting self-help. Emperors who felt insecure in their authority genuinely viewed philosophers, people who taught others to think clearly, question their own judgments, and resist being controlled by fear or flattery, as a real political threat. A population that couldn't be easily frightened or manipulated was a population that was harder to rule through intimidation, and Domitian apparently understood that well enough to remove the source of it entirely. He never wrote anything down himself, as far as we know. Everything we have from Epictetus, including the collection known as the Enchiridion, or Handbook, and a longer set of lecture notes called the Discourses, comes from a student of his named Arrian, who transcribed his teachings during lectures, much the way a student today might take detailed notes in a university class. Epictetus taught through spoken dialogue, argument, and direct engagement with his students, rather than through formal written treatises. And it's really only because Arrian took the trouble to write it all down that any of it survived at all. Arrian himself went on to become a notable historian and Roman official in his own right, which suggests something about the calibre of student Epictetus's school was attracting by that point in his life. Not just people looking for comfort, but serious minds who recognised they were encountering something worth preserving carefully. The school in Nicopolis reportedly drew students from across the empire, including, by some accounts, visits from figures connected to the imperial court itself. Curious about a teacher whose reputation had outlasted his own difficult beginnings by a wide margin. What makes Epictetus's story worth returning to isn't simply that he overcame hardship. Plenty of historical figures overcame difficult circumstances. It's that the entire philosophy he became known for grew directly out of that specific hardship, rather than existing separately from it. His core teaching that external circumstances, including your own body and your own freedom, are not truly yours to control, and that only your judgments and choices genuinely belong to you, isn't an abstract theory he arrived at through comfortable reflection. It's the conclusion of a man who had watched, firsthand, exactly how little control he actually had over his own body and circumstances for a significant portion of his life, and who found, somewhere in that experience, a form of freedom that couldn't be taken from him the same way everything else had been. Marcus Aurelius, born into more privilege and power than almost anyone in the empire, studied Epictetus's teachings closely decades after Epictetus's death, and clearly found something in them worth returning to again and again in his own private writing. It's a genuinely unusual thread running through history. An enslaved man's philosophy, transcribed by his student, eventually shaping the private thoughts of the most powerful man in the Roman world. There's a kind of irony worth sitting with here too. Marcus Aurelius held more external power than almost any human being in his era. Armies, law, the entire machinery of the Roman state answered to him. And yet the philosophy he leaned on most heavily, in his most private and difficult moments, came from a man who had once owned nothing at all, not even his own leg. It suggests something Epictetus himself would likely have found unsurprising, that the kind of freedom his philosophy actually cared about was never the kind an emperor has more of than anyone else. Whatever power Marcus held over the empire, it gave him no more control over his own judgments and reactions than Epictetus had possessed as a disabled, enslaved young man decades earlier, which may be exactly why the emperor needed the philosopher's teaching as much as, if not more than, anyone else reading it since. There's a further layer to this connection worth exploring. because it wasn't a simple case of Marcus discovering Epictetus's writing on his own and being moved by it from a distance. Marcus specifically credits his teacher Junius Rusticus in the opening pages of Meditations, with introducing him to Epictetus's teaching directly, lending him a personal copy of the notes Arrian had taken. That detail matters, because it means Marcus encountered this philosophy not as an abstract, historical curiosity, but as a living course of instruction, passed from a formerly enslaved teacher through a devoted student's careful notes, through a mentor who thought it important enough to physically hand to a future emperor. Philosophy, in this specific case, travelled through exactly 3 sets of hands before it reached the most powerful man in the world, and at no point in that chain did anyone involved seem to think Epictetus's background made his ideas less worth transmitting. If anything, the opposite seems true. A philosophy tested against real hardship carried more weight than one that had never been tested at all. It's worth considering too what this says about how Rome actually valued philosophical merit versus social status, at least among the specific circle of people who took Stoicism seriously. Rusticus could have handed Marcus the writing of any number of philosophers with more conventionally respectable origins. Well-born Greeks, established Roman thinkers, teachers with proper lineage and standing. Instead, the text he considered important enough to personally introduce to a future emperor came from a man whose own name recorded his status as property. That choice, whether Rusticus made it deliberately or simply because he recognized good philosophy when he encountered it, says something quietly significant about what the Stoics actually valued, not where an idea came from, but whether it held up under the kind of pressure most people never have to face at all. Subscribe for the next episode, where we'll cover one of the most useful Stoic ideas for handling setbacks. The idea that the obstacle itself can become the way forward.